All right, so for the last week, we have been numbed by the horrific loss of life in El Paso and Dayton and Gilroy. And those are just 3 of 253 mass shootings in this country already this year. So let's look at some of the information. There's so much false information that is spewed out that it gets lost sometimes. All right, is this the first one? Okay, these are the numbers. 253 mass shootings this year so far. 40,000 Americans are dying each year due to gun violence. It's almost as many as died in the entire Vietnam War. 6 times the gun deaths of Canada, 7 times the gun homicides of Sweden, and nearly 16 times that of Germany, based on a population of 1 million persons. So this is abnormal that we have the kind of slaughter going on in our country. Assaults in the United States are 3 times more likely to involve guns. All right, the myth, mental illness. Victims of gun violence, I should say it this way, mentally ill persons are more likely to be victims of gun violence than be perpetrators of gun violence. Most studies show it's under 5%. I've seen figures as low as 1%. So for the president to say that this is all about people who are mentally ill, it's not right, it's not true. And that's really important to point out. So 23 times, and the figure here, 23 times more likely to be victims of violence than the general populations. And to look at this, we have similar rates of mental illness as do other countries, but the gun violence here is much greater. The predictors of gun violence, past domestic violence. Domestic violence, family violence is significant in the deaths due to guns. Exposure to violence, history or pattern of violence, sense of resentment, impulsive anger, illegal use of controlled substances. As you walked in this morning, we put on the screen all of the mass shootings in this country over the last 20 years or so. And I also added the age of the shooter. And what is striking to me is that so many of these shooters are in their early 20s. They are disaffected, and if you go back into their background, they oftentimes are people that were loners in high school. They had issues that were not either identified or dealt with. One of the things we did after the Newtown massacre here in San Mateo County, and my hat's off to an extraordinary group of leaders in our county, we had a conference called After Newtown. And we brought an expert in, and we invited school district trustees, we invited all the local elected city council members, all the police departments, and all the healthcare professionals and mental health experts. And through that effort, Nancy McGee, excuse me, Nancy McGee, who was then part of the staff of the Office of Education in San Mateo, now is the actual superintendent of schools for San Mateo County, led this effort along with the county and my office. And we developed a whole protocol so that police departments are working with school districts when they identify children that have issues. They are responding to it. And it has worked extremely well, and there have been some potential cases that have been avoided because this kind of effort was underway. So you have a merger of schools, local law enforcement, and mental health professionals working together in San Mateo County. We're doing it here. We can do this across the country and help these disaffected youth before they then turn to guns. The other thing the president said, again, a myth, again, a talking point from the NRA. They talk about mental illness and video games. This is a really stunning graph. The first one shows video game revenues. The highest participation in video games is in Japan, South Korea, and then the United States, and you could see it. The second one shows the number of gun deaths per 100,000 people in 2017. It's not video games. It's just not. Okay, common fact in every shooting is easy access to a gun. An estimated 40% of gun purchases per year come from unlicensed sellers and are not subject to background checks. The legislation that's been passed by the House and is sitting in the Senate right now basically requires a background check for every gun sale in the country. "5% of the world's population, 45% of all the guns in the world. There are more guns in the United States, as many as 390 million guns, than there are people living in the United States. Studies show that gun safety laws tend to follow by a drop in gun violence." Now, this is a really stunning statistic. So the 40 deadliest gun shootings since 1949, 7 occurred during the 10 years before the assault weapons ban that Senator Feinstein was responsible for getting passed in Congress in 1994. It was in effect for 10 years because they put a sunset on it. During the time that the assault weapon ban was in place, there were only 2 mass shootings in the United States during that time. After the sunset occurred, where assault weapons could then be purchased again in the United States, over the last 15 years, we have had 26 mass shootings of the deadliest that come into the category of the deadliest. Violence against women is a huge component of gun violence. Firearm homicides rate for women in the United States is 16 times higher than in any other high-income country in the world. The presence of a gun in a domestic violence dispute makes it 5 times more likely to involve a fatality. The majority of mass shootings between 2009 and 2017 were related to domestic or family violence. In 59% of the mass shootings between 2015 and 2017, the shooter had a history of domestic violence or killed an intimate partner or family member in the shooting. Now, the bill that we passed in April, under the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, has a provision of what's called the Boyfriend Loophole. So presently, if you have, I'm losing my voice, excuse me. It's not good to lose the voice in the middle of a town hall, you know? So if you are in a violent relationship and you break off that relationship, there's a high potential for the person that's been offended by that to stalk and to commit violence. But a woman typically who fears will try and get an ex-parte order, will try and get a stay-away order, but as we know, they don't necessarily work. So unless you can take the gun away from the person that is stalking and intimidating and attempting to do harm to the person who has been in this dating relationship, we're going to continue to see that kind of bloodshed by the boyfriend who's been somehow rejected. These are the other countries. If you can see, the rate of violence against women is just off the charts per 100,000 female residents in all of these other countries. You probably can't see the flags underneath, but okay, and then, so we've passed these 2 bills, H.R. 8, H.R. 1112, the comprehensive background check bill. It's on Mr. McConnell's desk. He now says over the course of the last 4 days that he will take up the measure. They'll probably take up a different measure, but we have to resolve this. But this is, as I've said over and over again, a modest proposal. We already have a law in the books that says that in background checks, if you're a felon, you can't get a gun. If you're a domestic violence misdemeanor, you can't get a gun. And if you've been deemed mentally defective, which is a term of art, it's a horrible term of art, but it's only determined by a court of law, and it's a very small group of persons that fall into that category. But those are the 3 categories. And yet, for the longest time, you could buy a gun if you're a felon or a misdemeanor or deemed mentally defective if you went online or if you bought it at a gun show. I mean, that makes no sense. So that should be a no-brainer. The next one is called the Charleston Loophole. Dylan Roof went to buy a gun. He waited 3 days. They couldn't come back with a determination. So under the existing law, you got to get a gun. This is the NRA at work. So when they did the background check bill, they wanted to make sure that you could get a gun as soon as possible. So if in 3 days you couldn't determine whether someone fell into one of those 3 categories, you get the gun. Well, 10 days later, they realized he should not have been given a gun. Meanwhile, he had slaughtered all of those people in a church in Charleston. So this particular bill would close that loophole and create due process so that you could have an expedited review, but it does give 10 extra days to the FBI. The other problem we have is that many states don't contribute their data to what's called the federal NICS database, so we have incomplete records as well. So these are the bills that have been introduced on the House side that have yet to be taken up, but I'm confident will be taken up when we return. As you can see, this Extreme Risk Protection Order Act is what's called the red flag legislation. So you go to court to make the case that there is an extreme risk that a person who has a gun will either do harm to himself or others. And then this particular bill would prevent you from having a gun for a year. It's not perfect, but it's at least a step in the right direction. There's something like, I think, between 13 and 17 states that have already passed red flag laws. The assault weapon ban, which would also limit high-capacity magazines, and then the bill by Ted Deutsch that would also ban the manufacture, sale, and possession of high-capacity magazines. And then the final one is the people who are convicted of hate crime misdemeanors would be added to the list of those who are prohibited from purchasing or possessing guns. And I'm a co-sponsor on all of those bills. Okay, now I'm going to welcome up Griffin Dix, who's the chair of the Oakland-Alameda County Brady Chapter. He was a research director at Mac Week and founded his own research company serving the computer industry. Due to his personal tragedy, which he will be telling us about, he has dedicated his life to trying to stem the flow of gun violence. Please welcome Griffin.
Thank you.
So Griffin, tell us about your sad family tragedy.
In 1994, my 15-year-old son went to visit a friend of his one Sunday, and without telling my son what he was doing, the boy decided he'd show him his father's gun. So he went to his father's room and got the Beretta handgun that his father kept loaded and unlocked next to his bed for protection. The boy thought he'd unloaded it when he took out the magazine that had bullets in it. He picked up an empty one, walked back up to the bedroom where my son was, walked into the door and pulled the trigger thinking he'd unloaded the gun, and the bullet still hidden in the chamber of the semi-automatic handgun went through my son's shoulder and into his heart and killed him. The boy tried desperately to save him, but couldn't. And of course, we were devastated, I and my ex-wife. And the boy was devastated too. He had just shot one of his best friends. Gradually, we began to learn all about what was behind this, and there was a whole lot behind it. Not just the mistakes made by the father in storing this gun that he thought he had bought for protection, and the mistakes made by the son in picking up a gun that his father told him not to touch, but the way the gun industry markets guns, the fact that this gun should have had a prominent chamber-loaded indicator, and this boy had been to the shooting range with his father. If it had a prominent chamber-loaded indicator sticking up and down every time he loaded the last little bullet into the chamber and shot the gun and the chamber-loaded indicator disappeared, my son would be alive. So I began meeting some of the victims of the 101 California Street massacre, another assault weapons massacre that occurred in 1993. And those people, those courageous people, were responsible for passing the federal assault weapons ban and many other good gun laws in California. And I joined with many other people, and in California, we have passed in the last 25 years perhaps about 100 gun laws. California has become the state with the toughest gun laws, and since I'm a researcher, every year I compare firearm mortality rates in California with the entire rest of the country, with using the latest data that's come out from the CDC. The peak gun death rate in California and in the rest of the country occurred in 1993. All in the 1980s and early 90s, California's firearm mortality rate was a good deal higher than in the rest of the country. But as these gun laws took effect, California's firearm mortality rate declined well below the rate in the rest of the country. Now, since 1993, California's firearm mortality rate has declined by almost 4 times more than the reduction made in the rest of the country. And right at the center, the main thing is the gun laws that a state like California and some other states have passed work very well. That's the first thing to point out, because the gun industry and the gun lobby keep saying, oh, gun laws don't work. It's just untrue. So this summary you just gave of the important bills that are in Congress, and some of them have passed the House, they're very, very important. They could save many, many lives. If the rest of the country were to achieve the firearm mortality rate that California has right now, in 2017, 13,500 Americans would be alive just in that year alone. They would not have died in 2017 using the 2017, that's the latest CDC data. And right at the center of what California did, after the Stockton schoolyard shooting in 1989, California woke up to, we need better laws, and we passed a universal background check bill, and a part of it was that even people who have committed violent misdemeanors should not be able to possess or purchase firearms, because research showed that people who've committed violent misdemeanors also are likely to commit gun violence. So California's background check law was a little bit more strict than the federal law even. But that was right at the center of this reduction in firearm mortality that we achieved in California. California is a good model for what should be done at the federal level, but certainly we need at the federal level a thorough background check that involves a background check on every firearm sale. We need an extreme risk protection order law, otherwise known as a red flag law, that allows family members or law enforcement who know that someone is a risk to himself or others, they can take that information, petition a judge, give the information to a judge who will look at it and say, yes, the firearm should be removed temporarily from this person, hopefully while he gets some help. And thirdly, we need a assault weapons ban that, because the assault weapons ban we passed, as you saw, did work. And it drives me crazy that the media kept repeating the gun lobby's argument about the assault weapons ban. Well, it didn't reduce all of gun violence, but the assault weapons ban was never going to reduce all of gun violence. It was going to only reduce the gun violence committed with assault weapons, which is only a small share of the entire gun violence, because most gun violence is committed with handguns. Anyway, so I'm
You're doing good, Griffin. So I want to open it up to everyone else shortly, but let me ask you one last question. You listed a number of bills that you thought would be constructive. I've listed them as well. In your mind, what is the most important set of things we should do to reduce gun violence in the country?
I think requiring a background check on every gun sale would be crucial. And, the latest polls say at least 95% of Americans say, yes, we should have a background check on every gun sale. They don't want criminals to be able to purchase guns so easily. It's already law, as you say, that felons, domestic abusers, and people who've been committed because of a mental problem should not be able to buy guns, but we don't enforce it because we have this private party transfer and sale loophole. So we should enforce the law. That's basically a no-brainer, and Americans overwhelmingly agree. You would ask Americans, have UFOs landed? You wouldn't get 95% of Americans to say, oh, yeah. No, UFOs have not landed, but 95% of Americans agree we should have background checks on gun laws. NRA members, Republicans, gun owners agree overwhelmingly. So.
All right, please put your hands together and thank Griffin for his work. Thank you, Griffin. Thank you.